They held the world in their hands. They commanded armies, shaped civilizations, and made decisions that changed the course of human history. But in the end, not one of them could escape what comes for us all. The difference is, when the most powerful leaders in history died, the whole world felt it, and behind every official story, every sanitized history book entry, there is a darker, more human truth, a final chapter filled with fear, confusion, betrayal, and silence. Tonight, we pull back the curtain on the last hours of history's greatest rulers, the men and women who once seemed untouchable. What really happened when the lights went out for them? The answers are more haunting than you might expect. We begin in ancient Rome, in the year 44 BC, on a morning that started like any other, but would end in blood and the collapse of a republic. Julius Caesar was one of the most powerful men who had ever lived. He had conquered Gaul, crossed the Rubicon, survived civil war, and made himself the undisputed master of Rome. But on the Ides of March, the 15th day of that month, Caesar walked into the theater of Pompey and into a trap set by the very men he trusted most. That morning, his wife Calpurnia had begged him not to go. She had dreamed of his murder the night before and woke up terrified, pleading with him to stay home. Caesar, ever the confident general, dismissed her fears. A soothsayer in the street had already warned him to beware the Ides of March, and Caesar reportedly looked at the man and said simply, "The Ides of March have come." The soothsayer replied quietly, "Yes, but they are not yet gone." Inside the theater, the senators gathered around him under the pretense of presenting a petition. Then, all at once, they struck. Ancient accounts tell us that Caesar was stabbed 23 times. At first he fought back, grabbing at the blades with his bare hands. But as the men kept coming, as the faces of friends appeared among the killers, something in Caesar changed. He pulled his toga over his face and stopped fighting. He did not cry out, he simply fell. Historians believe only one wound was truly fatal, a single thrust between his ribs that pierced his heart. He died on the floor of the theater, surrounded by the men who once called him friend, and the republic he had transformed died with him that day too. Centuries later, another titan would meet an end just as dramatic, though far slower and far more humiliating. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who had crowned himself Emperor of France, who had marched his armies across Europe and redrawn the map of the world, spent his final years as a prisoner on a remote island in the South Atlantic Ocean called St. Helena. After his final defeat at Waterloo in 1815, the British exiled Napoleon to a place so isolated, so windswept and damp, that escape was virtually impossible. He was given a crumbling estate called Longwood House, a place plagued by rats, damp walls, and a cold wind that seemed to never stop blowing. For 6 years, Napoleon lived there under constant surveillance, stripped of power, stripped of purpose, and slowly stripped of his health. By 1821, he was a shadow of the man who had once terrorized every throne in Europe. He suffered from severe stomach pain, fatigue, and a creeping weakness that left him bedridden for weeks at a time. His doctors argued among themselves about what was killing him, some suggesting stomach cancer, others pointing to the miserable conditions of the island itself. Modern forensic tests conducted on strands of Napoleon's hair have found alarming levels of arsenic, leading some researchers to believe he may have been slowly poisoned, intentionally or through the arsenic-laced wallpaper that was common in damp homes of that era. In his final days, Napoleon was barely conscious. He dictated his last wishes, leaving money and messages to those who had served him. He spoke of France, of his son, of glory. On the 5th of May, 1821, as a violent storm raged outside Longwood House, Napoleon Bonaparte took his last breath. He was 51 years old. The man who had conquered half the world died cold and forgotten on a rock in the middle of the ocean. Now we travel to the 20th century, to one of the most contested and chilling deaths in modern history. Adolf Hitler, the man responsible for the most devastating war in human history, and the systematic murder of millions, met his end not in glory or on a battlefield, but in a concrete bunker buried beneath the ruins of Berlin. By April 1945, the city above him was burning. Soviet troops were closing in from every direction. His generals were deserting him. His empire was gone. And Hitler, the man who had demanded total loyalty and promised a 1,000-year reich, was trapped underground with a shrinking circle of loyal followers, descending rapidly into paranoia and denial. Eyewitness accounts from those inside the FU bunker describe a broken man pacing the corridors, raging at maps that no longer reflected reality, trembling from what many believe was advanced Parkinson's disease. On April 29, 1945, with Soviet soldiers just blocks away, Hitler married his longtime companion Eva Braun in a brief ceremony in the bunker. He then dictated his last political testament, blaming the war on the Jews and insisting history would prove him right. The next day, April 30th, Hitler and Eva Braun retreated to his private study. What happened inside that room has been debated ever since. The official account, supported by testimony from those nearby, states that Hitler shot himself in the head while simultaneously biting down on a cyanide capsule, and that Eva Braun died from cyanide alone. Their bodies were carried outside, dosed in gasoline, and burned in the Reich Chancellery Garden, as Hitler had specifically ordered, not wanting his body to be put on display like Mussolini's had been just days before. The bunker fell silent, and days later, Germany surrendered. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 years, and its architect died hiding underground like a man who had always known, on some level, that this was how it would end. But perhaps no death in the 20th century was more dramatic and more watched by the entire world than the assassination of John F. Kennedy on November 22, 1963 in Dallas, Texas. Kennedy was young, charismatic, and represented a new kind of American optimism. On that Friday morning, he was riding in an open motorcade through Dealey Plaza, waving to the crowds who had lined the streets to see him. His wife Jacqueline sat beside him in a pink suit. The sun was shining. The crowd was cheering. And then, in a matter of seconds, everything changed. The first shot cracked through the air and Kennedy lurched forward. Before the Secret Service agents could react, a second shot struck him in the head with devastating force. Jacqueline Kennedy, in a state of shock and instinct, crawled across the back of the moving limousine, reaching toward a piece of her husband's skull that had landed on the trunk. The car sped to Parkland Memorial Hospital, but the doctors who rushed to help him knew almost immediately that there was nothing they could do. At 1:00 p.m., John F. Kennedy was pronounced dead. He was 46 years old. In Washington, in a state of organized chaos and raw grief, Lyndon B. Johnson was sworn in as president aboard Air Force One, standing next to a blood-stained Jacqueline Kennedy, who had refused to change her clothes. She wanted the world to see what they had done, she said. The official investigation, the Warren Commission, concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. But 6 decades later, the questions have never truly gone away. And in some ways, they never will. Moving further back in time, we arrive at one of the most haunting endings in all of Russian history. Tsar Nicholas II, the last emperor of Russia, was a man caught on the wrong side of history. By 1917, the Russian Revolution had swept away centuries of royal rule, and Nicholas, along with his wife Alexandra and their 5 children, became prisoners of the Bolshevik government. For over a year, the family was moved from place to place, their world shrinking with every transfer. In the summer of 1918, they were held in a merchant's house in Yekaterinburg, a house the Bolsheviks had ominously renamed the House of Special Purpose. The children, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and young Alexei, tried to maintain something like a normal life inside those walls. They played games, read books, wrote in their diaries. They did not know what was coming. In the early hours of July 17, 1918, the family was woken and told to dress quickly. They were instructed to gather in the basement, told it was for their own safety as fighting was reportedly nearby. Nicholas carried his son Alexei, who was too weak to walk due to hemophilia, down the stairs. They stood in a small room in the basement, arranged almost like a family portrait. And then the guards came in. What followed was chaotic, brutal, and over in minutes. The entire family, along with their doctor and 3 servants, was shot and bayoneted. Their bodies were buried in secret, and for decades the Soviet government denied what had happened. Nicholas, who had once ruled over the largest country on earth, died in a basement, protecting his sick child in his arms. We cannot discuss powerful leaders dying without returning to Rome, this time to the most powerful ruler in the ancient world at the height of the empire's glory, and one of its most controversial emperors. Nero, who had famously fiddled while Rome burned, who had executed his own mother and persecuted early Christians, found himself abandoned and hunted by the end of his reign. By 68 AD, the Roman Senate had declared him a public enemy and condemned him to death by flogging. His generals had turned against him, his guards had fled, and the man who had once demanded to be worshipped as a god was hiding in a villa outside Rome, trembling and alone. Ancient historians tell us that Nero could not bring himself to die. He kept reciting lines of poetry, weeping, and asking those around him to kill him first so he could see what death looked like. In the end, with soldiers approaching the villa, Nero pressed a blade to his own throat with the help of his private secretary and uttered his final words, "What an artist dies in me." He was 30 years old. The man who had commanded the greatest empire on earth died in a ditch, afraid and forgotten. And then there is Joseph Stalin, the man who ruled the Soviet Union for nearly 3 decades with an iron fist, who had sent millions to their deaths in gulags and purges, who had made even his closest advisors too afraid to speak freely. By 1953, Stalin was 74 years old, increasingly paranoid, and in declining health. On the night of March 1st, guards outside his private dacha in Kontsevo grew worried when he failed to emerge from his room by late evening. He had strict orders that he was never to be disturbed, and his staff was paralyzed with fear. No one wanted to be the person who opened that door. Hours passed. Finally, a guard found the courage to knock, then to open the door. Stalin was found lying on the floor of his dining room, conscious but unable to speak or move. He had suffered a massive stroke. And here is where the story becomes something beyond ordinary history, something almost unbearable in its cruelty. Stalin lay on that floor for hours before anyone dared summon a doctor. His inner circle, including Beria, Malenkov, and Khrushchev, arrived at the dacha but did not immediately call for proper medical help. Whether from fear, confusion, or something more calculated, the most powerful man in the Soviet Union lay dying on a carpet, while the men who served him stood around, unsure whether saving him was something they truly wanted to do. When doctors finally arrived, they were visibly terrified to treat him, their hands shaking as they examined the man who had once ordered the deaths of doctors he suspected of conspiracy. Stalin lingered for 4 days, unable to speak or respond meaningfully. On the morning of March 5, 1953, surrounded by the same men who had feared and obeyed him for decades, Joseph Stalin died. Those who were present later described something extraordinary in his final moments. Just before he lost consciousness completely, Stalin opened his eyes and looked at those around him with an expression eyewitnesses said that looked like rage or terror. And then he was gone. Finally, we return to one of the most widely known and yet somehow still deeply mysterious deaths in modern political history. In 1945, as the world closed in on the final days of World War II, Benito Mussolini, the fascist dictator of Italy, who had allied himself with Hitler and dragged his country into ruin, was captured by Italian partisans while attempting to flee to Switzerland disguised in a German military coat. On April 28, 1945, just 2 days before Hitler's own death, Mussolini was taken to a small village called Giulino di Mezzigra on the shores of Lake Como. He was told to stand against a low stone wall. There are accounts that he opened his coat himself and said, "Shoot me in the chest." The execution was quick. His body, along with that of his mistress Clara Petacci, who refused to leave his side even at the end, was then transported to Milan and hung upside down at a gas station in the Piazza Loreto, the same square where Mussolini's forces had once executed 15 partisans and left their bodies on display. Enormous crowds gathered. History had come full circle. The man who had once made millions cheer his name died in a ditch beside a lake with borrowed clothes on his back. These were the most powerful people in the world. They commanded nations, directed history, and made the kind of decisions that shaped the lives of millions. But in the end, what their deaths show us is something both humbling and deeply unsettling. That power, no matter how vast, no matter how absolute, cannot protect you from time, from betrayal, from the quiet moment when the body simply stops. Caesar fell in a Senate chamber. Napoleon faded on a forgotten island. Hitler hid underground. Kennedy was taken in a moment of sunshine. Romanov children died in a basement. Nero wept in a ditch. Stalin lay on a floor while his servants stood watching, and Mussolini hung in a city square for the world to see. They all believed, at some point, that they were different, that the rules didn't apply to them. History answered them all the same way. If you enjoy dark stories like this, subscribe to Dark Files for more.